So I will start this session. First of all, ladies and gentlemen, I would like to welcome you to the first session of these research days of transport innovation for sustainable development and low carbon vehicle technologies. My name is Philippe Froissard. I'm the head of the Future Urban and Mobility Systems Unit in the Directorate General for Research Innovation at the European Commission. And I will be moderating today this session on low carbon vehicle technologies. Before moving to the content of the session, I would like to explain to you a little bit the rules of your participation in this session and the interaction that you will be able to have with the speakers that will be taking part in this session. Every speaker, and there will be three speakers in this session, will have about 15 minutes to present their work, and there will be a first round of questions that will be taken after each presentation. You can ask those questions in the live Q&A box that you will find on the website. You can also chat via the discussion forum, but I will only take the questions that have been put in the live Q&A box that is at your disposal. Also, when you ask the question to the speaker, you may wish to indicate to which speaker you want the question to be directed to. I am very grateful to the organizers to have given me the opportunity to moderate this session, as the topics that will be addressed here resonate fully with the research innovation priorities that we have identified in Europe and that will be supported by the new framework program for research innovation that is Horizon Europe. The research innovation activities that we will support will provide the solutions that we need to reach our objectives of becoming climate neutral by 2050 and of reducing the greenhouse gas emission of the transport sector by more than 90% by that same date. While there is a growing momentum as regards the deployment of zero-emission mobility solutions for passenger vehicles, the challenge that we have now is to increase the share of zero-emission heavy-duty vehicles. In that context, it is essential to compare the life cycle greenhouse gas emission of different solutions to assess the best possible options. This is what our first speaker will present to you today as a case study for Singapore. Lynette Cheah is an associate professor of engineering systems at the Singapore University of Technology and Design. She directs the Sustainable Urban Mobility Research Laboratory, which develops data-driven models and tools to reduce the environmental impacts of passenger and urban freight transport. Lynette will present today to you an analysis comparing life cycle greenhouse gas emissions of low carbon powertrains for heavy-duty commercial trucks. Lynette, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Philippe, for the kind introduction. Let me share my screen right now. Hello, everyone from Singapore. I am Lynette from the Singapore University of Technology and Design. I'm presenting this work, which is joint work with a colleague of mine, Leop, and we wanted to look at the life cycle perspective of alternative powertrains for heavy-duty commercial vehicles, which are trucks. So we looked into a Singapore case study, and here's our results. So for transporting goods and using for road freight, it runs mostly on diesel presently, and trucks are the fastest growing source of global oil demand. So we need to think about alternatives, and we also know that decarbonizing this group of vehicles would be more challenging. The impacts are not yet fully understood. So when we looked into the literature, we found a few studies, but those studying the impact of heavy-duty hydrogen fuel cell trucks seems to be lacking. And we also realized that in order to look at the life cycle impacts, it seems like every context differs a little bit. So that's why we focused on our case study of interest, which might be relevant in other cities as well. So these images at the bottom show a battery electric truck on the left and a hydrogen fuel cell truck, which are some of the alternatives being considered now for these heavier vehicles. So we wanted to look at the life cycle greenhouse gas emissions, and we looked at, the right-hand side shows the scope and the system boundary for the life cycle assessment. We're going to be evaluating the conventional diesel vehicle versus a hybrid version versus a battery electric version versus a hydrogen fuel cell version. And for each of them, we will be looking at the fuel cycle. So that's the burden associated with producing the fuel needed, be it diesel, electricity, or hydrogen. We'll be looking at the vehicle cycle, which concerns the embodied carbon in the materials used in the vehicles, assembling the vehicle, and then eventually using it, so the tank-to-wheel analysis. So this would have inputs if there's additional maintenance, or maybe battery replacements would also be accounted for in the vehicle use phase. The vehicle we're looking at is we call it heavy goods vehicle in Singapore. I think it's more commonly known as a Class 3 vehicle in the US, or a Category N2 vehicle in the European Union. And we're looking at the city use of these sorts of trucks in a city context, very dense urban environment. We'll be reporting the greenhouse gas emissions on a per ton kilometer basis. We'll use local data where available. If not, we'll be using existing lifecycle inventory databases like GREET or other available sources in the literature. So this is a model. The top right image shows the kind of the vehicle model that we chose to pay attention to. So this is a very common model of a vehicle in Singapore. It's Mitsubishi Canter. There are also some concept vehicles that are being explored for this kind of vehicles. So we looked at the specifications of the electric equivalent of this truck, as well as the fuel cell equivalent. As far as possible, we tried to use the same performance specs in terms of the power output across these alternative powertrains, and also make use assume that they carry the same payload across their lifetime. For the manufacturing and recycling, we use some of the emission factors available from the literature, and we will account for key components like the vehicle body itself, the battery unit, fuel cell unit, or hydrogen tank. And then for replacements, there's some range of assumptions that we had to make for the battery replacement. So for battery, we assume it lasts maybe 2,000 to 5,000 cycles, depending on the battery chemistry, the source of which is the Californian Air Resource Board. And the fuel cell units, it's going to last up to 19,000 hours. Breaking down the fuel cycle a little bit more, again, these are the fuel pathways, right? So this is how the fuel is eventually going to be obtained and processed and then used within the vehicle. So these are all the possible pathways for electric as well as a hydrogen fuel cell. For electric, the Singapore's electricity mix relies heavily on natural gas. Most of it is natural gas, which could be piped or liquefied natural gas that's shipped in to Singapore. For hydrogen production, there could be different pathways. We could use steam methane reforming, which is the most common approach now to produce hydrogen to be used in a fuel cell vehicle. And this can be in the form of a gas state or a liquid state. And then if we were to use fossil fuels, again, to produce the hydrogen, it would be this pathway here, again, using natural gas and then producing the hydrogen, and then compressing it and using it either in a gas form or liquid form on board the vehicle. Optimistically, if we could pursue solar, so this pathway looks into the potential for renewable energy use to produce the hydrogen. For Singapore, in terms of renewable energy, solar holds the most prospect, so we've considered this potential pathways. Of course, in your city and in your context, you would consider different fuel pathways as well. So we would account for transmission, distribution, charging, and refueling losses. And then where possible, again, we use local data sources, if not some of the pre-existing lifecycle inventory databases. For the use phase, we had the privilege of tracking a few heavy-duty commercial trucks in Singapore, and we used that information to construct a local drive cycle. So again, if you are looking to evaluate alternatives for your context, it might be helpful to keep track of how trucks tend to be used in your context. And then we were able to reconstruct a synthetic drive cycle in a sense, and use that to estimate the energy inputs required. So we have a model to estimate the power demand at the wheels based on the operating characteristics, basically this drive cycle. And then we account for energy recovery systems available for hybrid powertrains, battery electric, as well as fuel cell vehicles. The energy consumption would be reported on a per ton kilometer basis. So this is the utility we get out of the truck, how much tonnage it moves over a certain distance. So megajoules per ton kilometer. We will also be able to account for what might be the average, daily mileage of such a vehicle. We had a distribution of trucks that we were also tracking in Singapore. So about trucks travel about 100 kilometers per day. And then the average lifetime of about 14 years was used to estimate a total lifetime mileage that we expect these vehicles to go through. So here are the results. Here we have a chart that shows the life cycle greenhouse gas emissions reported in kilograms of CO2 equivalent per ton kilometer for the different powertrains that we evaluated. And this chart shows for the figure for the average payload of 50% over its lifetime, which means this truck over its entire lifetime is carrying about half the load or the capacity throughout its entire lifetime. So the conventional diesel is shown on the left. So this would be our base case. We'll be comparing the alternatives to our base case of using conventional diesel fuel. So here's the hybrid case, slightly lower. And then we have the battery electric vehicle, which is the third bar here, using the existing electricity mix. If we were to have a scenario where our electricity relies entirely on solar, which is not so, we're not quite there yet. But if we had a lot of renewable resources, we can bring that down. And I think we're realizing through a study like this that decarbonizing the fuel cycle is critical to get the reductions that we're looking for in terms of CO2 emissions from trucks. So in any case, be it considering alternative technologies, we have to consider the upstream energy production as well. The same charts were generated for an average lower payload of 25%, as well as a higher payload figure of 75%. But the relative standings don't change too much. Yeah. If we were to pay attention to the options which rely mainly on fossil fuels, which might be the situation in the near term, hybrids would be something we can pursue already immediately for these heavier vehicles. Fuel cell vehicles using steam methane reforming to generate the hydrogen, gaseous hydrogen would also offer an advantage over conventional diesel vehicles. So the percentage reductions are shown on the bottom left. If we were to consider switching out our diesel trucks right now with hybrid alternatives, we'll get reductions on a life cycle basis about 9 to 10%. For fuel cell vehicles, we get an advantage of 16 to 30% reduction. For battery electric vehicles with the current electricity mix, the results are a little bit mixed. There's a range of uncertainty associated with it. The uncertainties stem from the battery production and replacement intervals, but even with the median value, it's only a very slight marginal reduction. So again, even if we were to electrify our fleet, if we don't clean up the grid correspondingly, it's not going to help too much. Fuel cell vehicles using liquid hydrogen via steam methane reforming can potentially even lead to higher emissions. So not all the alternatives actually help reduce greenhouse gases on a life cycle basis. So again, we have to pay attention. This life cycle perspective is always very helpful to look at the upstream impacts. Yeah. We can also consider the break-even mileage, where some of these alternatives offer advantage over the conventional diesel. So if you read these charts, so these are the cumulative lifetime CO2 emissions, total tonnage of CO2 equivalent across the horizontal axis, which shows the vehicle's lifetime mileage. So as a more fuel efficient vehicle, you would see the cumulative greenhouse gas emissions, lower than the conventional, which is the gray line shown over here. So so again, for the battery electric vehicle, which is this purple chart in the middle, only slight advantage. For the diesel hybrid, it shows some advantage, as well as for the fuel cell vehicle on the right-hand side using steam methane reforming. So just wrap up now with a few brief policy recommendations. I think decarbonizing the upstream fuel production is critical if we wanted to look at decarbonizing road freight. And then with limited renewable energy options, like in the case of Singapore and maybe other contexts as well, fuel cell vehicles using gaseous hydrogen and diesel hybrids are potential options. And then I think many of these technologies are still in the very early stages of development, so we definitely need to keep considering trying them out in trials, local technology pilots, demonstrations with the research community or with the industry. And then I think that will help us again find out more about these alternatives and how feasible they can be. For future work, we're not done yet with the work here, so we want to find out a little bit more. We want to account for maybe future developments in the energy sector if we were to decarbonize it or couple it with other technologies like carbon capture and storage. We want to account for the diversity of the ways these trucks are used in any context. So a construction vehicle is very different from a delivery vehicle, for example. So we want to account for different use phases and operational dynamics. And then consider other environmental impact categories as well in our assessment. So far, we've only looked at the greenhouse gas emissions impact, but we could also look more into the local air pollution impacts and the resource availability questions associated with making these alternative vehicles. And then, of course, interest for operators they will be very keen to know more about the life cycle costs associated with these alternatives. That's it. Thank you so much for your attention, and I'll be very happy to answer any questions that you might have.
Thank you very much, Lynette. Thank you for this very clear presentation, very interesting presentation of the different case studies that you have carried out in Singapore. And we have already a question that I might actually put to you, which is from Paul Minette. And the question is, do you include the manufacture of the solar panels in the battery electric vehicle solar case?
Yes. I think we did account for the manufacturing of the solar panel as well.
Okay, thank you very much. So I just remind the participants that they can put their questions in the live Q&A box at any time. As I said to you, there will be the opportunity to for the speakers to ask questions just after their presentation. And then we will have a final roundtable discussion at the end of this session, where again the participants will have the opportunity to ask questions to the different speakers. So I don't see any more questions presently from neither the live Q&A nor the discussion forum. But maybe I have a question on my own to you, Lynette. What kind of recommendation would you actually give to local authorities? Because I noticed that you expanded a little bit on that in your paper, that would like to encourage low carbon technology for heavy-duty vehicles.
Yeah, I think the alternatives aren't that many, compared to light-duty trucks, where electrification is a clear option. Electrification didn't seem to be too obvious in its advantages for heavy vehicles. So for heavy vehicles, which is responsible for a big part of road freight too, I think we have to start looking at alternatives quickly and start investing in some of the technologies that we think have a potential in any given context. So again, look more carefully into the use case in your context, consider the alternatives available, consider the power options available, electricity generation options available too, and whether or not it makes a life cycle sense, on a life cycle basis.
Okay, thank you very much. So what I suggest now is, since there does not seem to be any direct question to you on the presentation that you made now, that we can move to the next speaker. And then from the busy streets of Singapore, we will be moving now with our second speaker to the campus of San Jose State University in California. Burford Furman is a professor of mechanical engineering at San Jose State University. His area of teaching and research are focused primarily on mechatronics, automated transit networks, precise machine design, and dynamics. Since 2012, he has been working intensely with interdisciplinary groups of students to develop solar-powered automated transit networks. Burford will present today his work on solar-powered automated transportation networks, which he claims could be a bold leap forward for truly sustainable transportation. Burford, I believe that your presentation will be a team effort, in the sense that there will be other participants from your team that might come in and contribute to your presentation. I believe that Ron Swenson and Jack Fogelquist will also be joining you. Burford, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Philippe. It's a pleasure to be here. Can you see the slides?
Yes.
Great. So we appreciate being invited to present our work on a bold innovation for urban mobility. So the way we've organized our presentation is I will present some of the problems that we have with urban transportation, and then Ron Swenson will present our new vision for solar-powered transportation. Jack will summarize a feasibility analysis for a proposed instantiation of this solar-powered transportation. And then Ron will be back to cover some policy recommendations and a call for action. So let me start with some of the bad news. At risk of preaching to the choir, this is the total greenhouse gas emissions in the US from 2019. And as you can see, the large share comes from transportation. When you break that down, the large share of that is due to light duty vehicles, which EPA classifies as passenger cars and light duty trucks. Breaking that down further, you find that passenger cars make up the largest share of that 59%, with light duty trucks about 30%. So we're, I think, justified to really focus on passenger cars in terms of trying to reduce greenhouse gases. So electrification is a step in the right direction, but there's some problems. If you look on the left here, this is a US electricity generation on fuels, and the US Energy Information Administration projects that even out to 2050, over a third of electricity generation will be from natural gas. And since these cars will plug into a grid, which is going to have some kind of a mix, that's still a large fraction of greenhouse gases being emitted. So even though renewables are planned to double in that time frame, there'll still be greenhouse gases emitted even with electric vehicles. Another problematic thing here is a projection with the penetration of electric vehicles, projected again out to 2050. It's relatively small, so even the number of vehicles that will be there to in a sense plug into the grid that could be still dirty is relatively small. So that seems to be a real problem, and electrification then seems to be really a very slow way to decarbonize transit. And this is kind of whimsically shown in this diagram, also depending on the mix in the grid. It's possible that battery electric vehicles are even a worse choice. This was an interesting study by Newcastle and others in 2016 that compared battery electric vehicles with fuel efficient, greener gasoline vehicles, and found that if you drove a Nissan Leaf, at least in many parts of the US, you would actually be emitting more greenhouse gases than if you drove a Prius on gasoline, due to the electricity mix. So even though we're seeing reductions now, and if you were able to drive, say, a Tesla purely powered by solar energy, you would still have a large physical footprint. And this is a problem in our urban areas due to need for parking and space in the cities. Even with a battery electric vehicle, you're still going to have this kind of problem. The way we do transportation, since everything competes for the same space, this is almost inevitable. And this is kind of shown pretty strenuously here for US fatalities. Back many decades, it's really unconscionably high. And that's something that we have a problem with the way we do urban transportation. So kind of in summary, our transportation system really does not lead to human flourishing. So we need a more effective solution that can really attack greenhouse gases and some of these other problems. So what I'd like to do now is hand it off to Ron Swenson to show you a better way. So Ron, you ready?
Yes, thank you very much, Buff. And it's a pleasure to be here with you folks from around the world, from the comfort of my own home. I want to describe to you the Spartan Superway. The mascot of the university is a Spartan, and that acronym, as an acronym, stands for Solar Powered Automated Rapid Transit Ascendant Network. And the word ascendant refers to the fact that we have come above the street level, and in so doing, we enable repurposing of some of the urban landscape, as you see here in this picture. The unique part of it that we bring to the story, of course, besides the mechatronics, which Professor Furman and his students have been developing since we began this project together in 2012, is the addition of a canopy, which enables us to have 100% solar power in the system. So by elevating the system, our urban footprint is simply the columns that affect the street level. And as you see here, it allows for a lot of activity below, and it can still be compatible, as you see, with bus rapid transit, with automobiles and such. But can you go back just a second and show the infrastructure? Very important to note here that in going to the station, there is a fork in the road, and that allows for having the vehicles that you and I are traveling on together going past the station without stopping. And as a result of that, even though you may have a new Tesla that goes 0 to 60 miles an hour in 3 seconds, we can still get across the town faster than you do because we don't have to make any stops through this mesh network. And so unlike a corridor of a train system where you have to stop with everybody else at every station, in this case, every vehicle is an express vehicle between its origin and its destination. So moving on then, I want to tell you a little bit about the particulars. As you see here, in the old days, there was a lot of commotion, and people had some misgivings about extending this into the cities that we live in today because, of course, it's very old-fashioned and noisy. But the system we're proposing here is much more like the iPhone because, for one thing, it's lightweight, and for another, it's solar-powered, and for another, it has all the modern conveniences that we've come to be expecting. Now, at San Jose State, the campus is split in half with a athletic program on the south end and the main campus being quite a distance. And even though it's only 1.5 kilometers, about 1 mile, nonetheless, it takes far too long for people to get between these two extremes. So we are proposing a system that we'll tell you a little more about later, but I want to just give you a feel for what this might look like at the various stations. This is the station most conveniently located to the campus, and it again shows the offline function, and you see some cars making their way. And then the next one shows that it is bicycle friendly. You can have shared use of the vehicle with both handicapped access as well as having animals, pet animals, as well as bicycles in the system. And then finally, the South Station is very accommodating to the various sports that we have. Now, I want to pass this on to Jack Fogelquist, who will talk about how, having analyzed the amount of solar we can capture, just how far that can take us. Go ahead, Jack.
Thanks a lot, Ron. So as Ron mentioned, a 5-kilometer-long automated transit network has been proposed to connect the north and south campuses of San Jose State University. And the idea is that this system would replace the diesel shuttle bus service that currently connects the two campuses, called the SJSU Park and Ride. While the proposed ATN satisfies many important criteria from an urban planning perspective, questions about the energy system arose. Like, is it feasible to power an automated transit network with solar energy? How many solar panels would be needed, and how much would it cost? Why use solar instead of electricity from the grid? And so our analysis here summarizes the findings from a feasibility study centered around these questions. And so here we began by characterizing the energy demand of the ATN with urban mobility simulation tools called SUMO and SUMO-Pi. SUMO-Pi was developed by Professor Jörg Schweitzer of the University of Bologna and is a graphical user interface for SUMO, the urban mobility simulation suite developed by DLR. The proposed ATN was modeled with SUMO and configured with the ridership profiles shown on the left, which were derived from the SJSU Park and Ride data. An example simulation is shown on the right, in which virtual patrons board and alight ATN pod cars traveling through an offline station. After using SUMO-Pi to simulate the transient energy demand, a model was developed to simulate the performance of the complete energy system. This includes electricity generation from the solar photovoltaic canopy, energy storage in a bank of lithium-ion batteries, interactions with the electrical grid, and conversion losses and inefficiencies along the way. It's important to note that the electrical grid serves as both an energy source and sink through which surplus solar electricity can be exported and demanded electricity can be imported. The simulation is performed for every hour of the year, and an example output is shown in the upper right for 2 arbitrary days in April. Here, electrical power is plotted against time, with the yellow curve representing the solar power, the black curve representing the transit system demand, the green curve indicating the battery power, and the red indicating the grid power. The curves show that the surplus solar electricity is used to charge the batteries during the day, which are then discharged overnight to meet the demand of the transit system. And transient simulation like this allows us to parameterize the energy system, specifically the rated capacities of the solar and battery systems, to optimize performance. So a solar canopy with 8 modules across its width was observed to be the most economical configuration, subject to the width constraints imposed by the surrounding trees and buildings that line the route. This plot summarizes the grid interactions for this configuration in function of the battery system capacity plotted on the horizontal axis. The light blue curve indicates the annual energy sunk to the grid. This is the surplus solar electricity that was generated when the batteries were fully charged. And the dark blue curve indicates the annual energy sourced from the grid. And that's the electricity that our energy system needed to import in order to meet the transit system demand, typically on cloudy or rainy days. And we want this curve to be as low as possible because imported electricity is expensive and can have high carbon emissions associated with it. And the error bars here on these curves represent a ridership uncertainty of plus or minus 15%. And finally, the expected cost of the energy system is plotted in orange on the secondary axis based on benchmarks published by the National Renewable Energy Laboratory earlier this year. And so, as we can see, the energy system exports more energy than it imports for every battery configuration. However, the battery system must be small in order to minimize costs. And so we found that the optimal battery capacity that minimizes both system cost and imported energy was observed to be 9.8 megawatt hours. For reference, the battery inverter unit shown on the right here has a 1 megawatt hour capacity and is about the size of 5 refrigerators set next to each other. So our proposed system would have 10 of these units distributed along the route. After observing that the system is functionally feasible, we set out to evaluate the economic viability. So we wanted to compare the expense of building and operating a solar battery power plant versus simply purchasing electricity from the local utility company. And this was done by comparing the levelized cost of energy, according to this formulation from the US Department of Energy, which values generated electricity based on expenditures related to investment, operations and maintenance, and grid interactions. And so the results shown here indicate that it will cost 8% less to power the ATN with solar energy than with electricity purchased from the grid. In our final result, we compared the emissions of the solar-powered ATN with the grid-powered ATN and the SJSU Park and Ride. CO2 emissions are shown on the left, and particulate matter 2.5 emissions are shown on the right, with the red bars indicating positive emissions and the green bars indicating reductions. The solar-powered ATN was the only system to yield a net reduction of emissions due to the surplus of clean solar energy exported to the grid. The small positive emissions from the solar-powered ATN were the result of importing electricity from the fossil-fueled grid, though these emissions were doubly offset by the reductions. And in sum, it is viable to power the proposed ATN with a PV system of 6.2 megawatts rated output, coupled with a lithium-ion battery system of 9.8 megawatt-hour capacity. To put this in perspective, the solar canopy would be 7 meters wide with a 1 megawatt-hour battery pack spaced every 500 meters along the route. And we determined that it was more economical to power the ATN with solar energy than electricity purchased from the utility company, as well as finding that the system would yield net negative CO2 and PM2.5 emissions. And now we'll turn it back to Ron, who will address our recommendations and call for action.
Thank you, Jack. I just want to call your attention to a conference that was held a year and a half ago in Stockholm, where our moderator, Mr. Froissard, at Viable Cities said that conventional approaches will not be sufficient in mobilizing research and fostering innovation. We must be bold and inspirational. To that end, I want to say that we have now shown you that 100% solar powered transit is feasible in your cities. And so that in turn brings us to point out that we have shown you how you can actually weave this solution into the urban fabric of your cities. That being said, we want to suggest that if you know anybody in your city who can deliver on this, by all means, go talk to them. There's no time to waste, and we're over here and you're over there, so go for it. Find those people and get busy. But if no one else has done it in your community, then we challenge you to challenge us. Please get a hold of us and make sure that we're talking and doing the same as our talk. In this regard, we encourage privately funded solar-powered transit networks. We suggest that you require 100% or more solar power in order to grant rights of way for such systems to be built. And then thirdly, we encourage you to charge operators 5% of gross revenue for those rights of way. And the reason I bring this up is because even though we are in the 21st century now, we have not improved the average production of a vehicle in over 100 years. So in order to get to net zero, we must do something radically different. And so as a result of that, we have established colleagues around the world. We can tell you more. So we would encourage you to convene your cities, universities, and industries to join the Spartan Superway and come talk to us. And we left there a website that you can go to see our work and follow up in that fashion.
Thank you very much, Ron, colleagues, and thank you, Ron, for quoting good authors. Certainly interesting to put that into that context. We have received a couple of questions. I'm going to ask two questions to you and the team, and then we'll move to the. I'll keep the other questions for the last round table. So starting with question from let me double check, from Paul Minette again. Would it be fair to expect that changing the passenger travel brackets carpooling, van pooling, buses would be more effective way to reduce emissions in the short term rather than switching to electric vehicles? Who wants to take that question?
Well, that will certainly help, but you know, when I look at the IPCC, you know, sort of targets, we have to do much more and go much faster, or we're in trouble. So I think we need a, you know, crash kind of investment in implementing these systems as we've shown, and I think we can get there faster.
So we have another question related also to what you were saying. Does the level of ridership have an impact on the amount of energy used? Your presentation seems to suggest this. It is hard to imagine that the amount of passengers would have such an impact.
Jack maybe can answer that
one. Yeah, given the nature of this type of system, we're kind of proposing to deploy the amount of pod cars circulating around the route that are needed to meet the ridership demand. And so that allows us to scale the energy demand accordingly.
Okay. So what I suggest is to keep the other questions to the last session, as I said. And I'm just looking at, yeah, there are quite many more questions that I will ask you to answer. But I'd like now to move to the third speaker of this session. And thank you again for the presentation that you made. So the next speaker of these sessions comes from Newcastle University in the UK. Gustav Bösehans is a sustainable transport researcher with an environmental psychology background. His main research interests lie in shared electric mobility hubs, what's called e-hubs, sustainable urban design, and traveler segmentation. Gustav is working as a research associate on the EU-funded e-hubs project, of which Newcastle University is a project partner. He will present to us today his work on predicting the intention to use different types of shared electric vehicles using a multiple linear regression approach. Gustav, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much. Yeah, it's nice to meet everyone, and it's a great opportunity to be able to present, share some of our research findings today. There we go. Yeah, as Philippe has already said, I'm a research associate at Newcastle University and currently working on the eHubs project. And today I would like to share some preliminary findings with you. If you're interested in finding out more about electric shared mobility hubs, please feel free to check out our website. I've posted the link at the bottom, and there you can find out more about who's involved in the project, what the project is about, and what activities we've been up to. Now for my presentation, first I will give you a quick definition of what we define as an e-hub. And I'm also going to briefly touch on what we regard as the added value of mobility hubs. And then for the main part of my presentation, I will focus on sharing some results on predicting the intention to use different shared electric vehicle types. Now we define an e-hub as a mobility hub that has at least two different shared electric vehicle types available. So this could be any combination of, for instance, shared electric bikes, cargo bikes, cars, or e-scooters. And we have seen in the previous two presentations that electrification on its own is not the solution. That's why mobility hubs are shared, so everyone has access to the vehicles at any one point in time. And of course, preferably mobility hubs also would have integration with public transport to enable first and last mile trips. But that's not all there is to mobility hubs, because mobility hubs are not just about mobility, they are also can be social workspaces. They can offer amenities such as lockers for storing items or for retrieving deliveries. They can also have charging points for electric vehicles, and they can also have other amenities such as maybe a small coffee stand or a small shop to go. On this slide, you can see an example of a mobility hub on the more neighborhood street scale level. And as you can see, you have a control panel visible where you get information about renting the vehicles, maybe also additional information about the weather, etc. You can also see a shared electric car and a few shared electric bicycles and a little seating area for people to rest. And importantly, on the other side of the road, you can also see a bus stop. So there's always the idea that mobility hubs are really connecting to existing public transport networks. Now you might wonder what is the added value of shared mobility hubs compared to traditional sharing schemes, because in the last few years we have seen dozens of shared mobility schemes about shared bicycles, e-scooters and cars popping up. So you might wonder, what is the point of hubs? Well, the most obvious point is that shared mobility hubs provide different types of vehicles that are suited to different situations and also to different target groups. For instance, if you might just want to take a tour through the city, you might just want to pick an e-scooter, whereas if you want to do some groceries, you might opt for an e-cargo bike, or if you want to pick maybe a friend from the airport, you pick an electric vehicle. And as I said earlier, hubs can have a lot of various different additional functions as well. So it's not just about mobility, but also about the social and communal aspects. However, there is some early research suggesting that there may be little added value of e-hubs over more traditional car sharing schemes. And that's also something that we are very interested in exploring. Now, for the main part, I will share with you some results of an analysis that we conducted in the last few months. And a primary question that we're interested in is what distinguishes the different vehicle types. So in particular, we want to know, are the intentions to use different shared electric vehicle types predicted by the same or different variables? Or if we put that in other words, do the different shared electric vehicle types appeal to the same, or do they appeal to different audiences? And of course, by exploring this, we can also draw some conclusions about the added value of shared mobility hubs. Of course, there has already been a lot of research happening in this area. For instance, work by Reck and Axhausen suggests that micromobility users tend to be young, university-educated males in full-time employment, living in affluent households without children or cars. But of course, these things depend on the context. So in different cities, different countries, the user groups may, of course, vary. We also know that shared mobility use is in parts driven by environmental concerns, as is the case sometimes for e-scooters, and people are very attuned also to the trip efficiency and the individual convenience of using shared vehicles. We also know from the literature that e-bike sharing in particular has a tendency to substitute public transport trips, whereas cargo bike sharing is particularly effective in substituting trips by car. And last but not least, we know that perceiving benefits of shared mobility is an important predictor, especially in the use of car sharing as well. Now, for the research that I will present now, we are using the data from a general population questionnaire that we administered as part of the eHubs project. And in total, we achieved about 2,500 usable responses across several countries. In the survey, we had a variety of measures. We had attitudinal measures, demographics, and of course, also information about people's travel behavior. And we surveyed respondents from 7 European cities who are all partners of the eHubs project. So we had cities in the Netherlands, Belgium, Germany, France, and the UK. And the primary purpose of the survey was to identify likely target groups of e-mobility hubs and also to estimate mode shift and emission reductions. We launched the survey last year in March. Unfortunately, this was just before the first lockdown measures across Europe came into place. So we had to do some modifications and ask people to think about their past travel behavior. And we administered the survey with the help of the cities. And in the case of the two biggest cities of the project, Amsterdam and Manchester, they both used polling agencies to obtain representative samples for us. We also have a deliverable which summarizes some of the aggregate findings of this survey. And if you're interested in this, you can just send me a message via email and I can send you a copy of that. Now, one of the most important measures in our survey was the intention to use different types of shared electric vehicle. And we measured intention using a continuous likelihood scale ranging from 0, extremely unlikely, to 100, extremely likely. And we opted for this very broad format because we wanted to get as much variance in responses as possible. Variance that is harder to get with 5 or 7 point likelihood scales where points in the data tend to overlap. Now, in terms of the analysis, we used a basic multiple linear regression approach using the forward method, and we used the 0.01 significance threshold because we wanted to focus only on those predictors that really significantly contribute to the variance in intention. We used the intention scores as dependent variables, and we entered the predictors in 2 separate blocks. In the first block, we had demographic variables, attitudinal factors, and commuter satisfaction. Whereas in the second block, we had travel-related variables, including possession of driver's license, people's traveler identity, so whether they regard themselves as either a cyclist, walker, or car driver, for instance, information about people's general travel behavior, and also the number of vehicles available in the household. Now, on the following slides, I'm going to show you the regression tables, but I'm not going to read the tables to you. I'm going to spare you that. So I've just summarized the results for each shared vehicle type on a different slide. So on this slide, you can see the results for predicting the intention to use electric bikes available via e-hubs. And in this case, we found that positive attitude was by far the strongest predictor of intention. So if I just go quickly back to the regression table, you can see that a positive shared mobility attitude has a beta of 0.5, which is substantially higher than the remaining predictors. We also found that a pro-environmental attitude increases the attitude to use shared electric bicycles, whereas perceived barrier decreases the intention, which is quite intuitive. We also found that younger age groups generally are more interested in using shared electric bikes, which again is something we already know from the literature. So you can see that the age groups from 18 to 44 were more interested, and this effect was stronger the younger respondents were. And we also saw that owning a bicycle also has, so people who already own a bicycle are more likely to want to try out e-hubs. Or bicycles in this case. We ran the same analysis for e-cargo bikes, and again, we found a similar pattern in attitudes, which was identical as in the case with e-bikes. We also again found an effect of age, although in this case it was only one age group which had a significant effect. And again, people who already own a cargo bike expressed greater interest. Interestingly, we also found that frequent cyclists, so people who cycle on 5 days a week or more, expressed a much greater interest in using shared cargo bikes. And the same was also true of regular public transport users, so people who use public transport on 1 or 2 days per week. For e-scooters, again, the positive attitude was the strongest predictor. However, we did not find that the pro-environmental attitude or perceived barriers had any effect on people's intention. As you might expect, young people were more keen to use e-scooters, and it was the same pattern as with e-bikes, meaning that the younger respondents were the greater their intention to use e-scooters. Also, we found that frequent public transport users, so people who use public transport on at least 3 to 4 days per week, expressed a much greater intention to use e-scooters. And finally, we also looked at the predictors of the intention to use electric cars. And in terms of attitude, again, we found the same pattern as for electric bikes and cargo bikes. And we also found that holding a driver's license increases intention, which is plausible, of course, because if you don't have a license, you can't drive a vehicle. So before concluding, I'm just going to sum up some general conclusions from this analysis. Overall, we did not observe any differences in intention between genders. We found that positive attitude is by far the strongest predictor of the intention to use any of the shared electric vehicle types. We also saw that with the exception of e-scooters, that holding a positive pro-environmental attitude increases the intention to use vehicles, whereas perceived barriers decrease intention. And in the case of e-scooters and e-bikes, again, we found that young adults, that is those between 18 to 44, express a greater intention to use vehicles, whereas for cargo bikes, this was only respondents between 25 and 34 years. And last but not least, there were also some smaller differences that we found that I didn't talk about now, but we found in general that Germans were the least fond of shared mobility options. So I'm German as well, so I can understand a bit why that is, except for the case of e-scooters. Yeah, and to sum up with some conclusions and recommendations. So we did find that different types of shared electric vehicles do appear to appeal to different audiences. So we found, for instance, that shared electric bikes and e-scooters are particularly attractive to younger respondents. We found that e-cargo bikes are particularly attractive to current cyclists, which overall suggests that there is added value of e-hubs because they can be used from different target groups and for different situations. We also saw that electric cars appeared as a relatively neutral mode because we didn't see any differences in terms of age groups or in terms of gender, which suggests that this is a mode that can be used by everyone. However, it should also be said that there is limited potential of shared mobility hubs to replace trips by car. Because one of the main objectives that we have in the sharing economy is we want to get people out of their cars. But as our findings show, especially in the case of e-scooters, there's always the potential that those modes might replace trips that are already being made using sustainable modes. So that's one thing that we should keep in mind. Regarding next steps, we also have stated preferences data, which we collected from the two biggest partner cities, Amsterdam and Manchester. So we're currently analyzing this data to provide more insight into people's decision-making regarding shared mobility options. And we will also be launching a second questionnaire focused on the users of mobility hubs, with the specific aim to investigate mode shift and also explore the desirability of various mobility hub aspects. And I hope you found some interesting results in the presentation, and if you have any questions, feel free to ask them now. And if you want to stay in touch, you can also follow me on Twitter or connect on LinkedIn. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Gustav, for this presentation. Very informative. And indeed, we have a number of questions that have been put in the chat for you. Maybe I will ask you two questions first. One actually very much linked to the presentation that you made, and which is, will you compare your finding of e-hubs also with conventional mobility hubs like Mobilitätsstationen or Mobipunkt in Bremen, Dresden, or Leipzig?
Yeah, we definitely intend to see what the difference is, because especially in eHubs, the focus is on electric vehicles. So that's also something that's new. And we are very interested to see what we will find out from the actual users who are using the hubs at this moment, and what impact this has on substituting trips and also potential emission reductions.
Okay, maybe another question on the survey. How random was that survey? Meaning, can the results be extrapolated to the wider population?
Sorry, how long this?
How random was the survey?
Yeah. The approach that the different cities took was quite different, so there was definitely some variation between the cities. But in the case of Amsterdam and Manchester, we had polling agencies who collected the data for us, which meant that we received representative samples from those two cities in particular. And from the other cities, it was a bit more at random because the cities handled the distribution on their own. But in general, we have had a fairly representative sample, so the results are quite representative in that sense.
Okay, thank you. Actually, I have a question of my own. So you made an analysis across 5 European countries. And what are the disparities that you have found between these countries, if any?
Yeah, there are definitely a lot of differences. We know that, of course, we had 3 Dutch cities among the cities we investigated. And of course, the Netherlands are one of the countries that is already very forward in terms of active mobility, in terms of cycling and walking. And we found, especially in these contexts, there was more a greater interest in cargo bikes and scooters, because people usually already own a bike and already do a lot of trips by bike, which suggests that, for instance, in contexts that are more car dominant, such as in the UK or Germany, there's a bigger interest maybe towards bicycles instead of cargo bikes. So there are definitely a lot of differences. Also, depending on the size of the cities, we found that especially in the smaller cities as well, there was a greater interest in the active modes, whereas in the bigger cities, there was a tendency more towards scooters and cars, for instance. But yeah, if you're interested and would like to find out more about the survey in particular, you can ask me about the aggregate report results, and you can read up a bit on that.
Okay, thank you. Maybe I will also pass to you 2 questions that are coming from Amy Whelan. How do you include and provide for accessibility needs in these eHub spaces? Has this been factored into your prediction of intention and barriers?
No, in this case, we didn't factor those variables in, because in reality, there's a bit of a disparity in the vision that we have of eHubs and what is in place in reality. So it's difficult to model this at this point, but that's definitely an important point and something that we hopefully can consider in the future once we have more hubs actually on the ground, and especially bigger hubs as well.
Okay, thank you very much, Gustav. So now I'm turning back to the 3 speakers from this session. We have about 10 minutes left before the end of this session. This is an opportunity for you to come back to some of the issues that you have addressed, some of the questions that have been put to you. I noticed that some of you have already answered some of the questions that were put in the chat. There is one left that is targeted at Lynette, and maybe I will read out to you, and you might wish to provide an answer to that question. Lynette, have you considered comparing your data with CNG trucks? I understand from German passenger car comparisons that CNG is more environmental friendly than battery electric vehicles. Can you provide an answer to that? Yes,
thank you. Thank you for the question. CNG in Singapore came and went for passenger vehicles, but I think it is something that we should think about. Again, maybe the timing wasn't right. Back then, it came and went, I think, primarily because of the infrastructure issue. There wasn't enough charging or refueling stations, and I think we started out with a small fleet, some trial vehicles, but it never really grew beyond that. But maybe the timing is right to consider this option. Again, we are, we don't have that many alternatives, so we should think of everything that can be looked into. Yes.
Thank you. Actually, I have a question to you. Since your work has been completed, have you seen or do you see an evolving trend in Singapore as regard the uptake of low emission vehicle for heavy duty vehicles?
Trains,
A trend. So already an evolution as regard preferred options between battery electric vehicles, fuel cell vehicles, hybrid diesels, and so on.
Right. About a year ago, the government announced this initiative towards electrifying our road fleet, but it was more targeted towards the smaller vehicles, the passenger vehicles, the light duty trucks. So I think that path is being put forth, and I think we will make a march towards electrification. But then again, the challenge is for the heavier vehicles where there are fewer alternatives. Yes. But it does seem that electrification is gaining pace in Singapore and in many other cities as well.
Indeed. Thank you very much. Maybe I would have a question to Buff and his colleagues. So I understand and I see that you have already replied to a number of questions. Is there anything outstanding that you would like to share with the rest of the participants?
Well, yeah, Ron's computer died, so he didn't have a chance to chime in. So I'll let him, if he has anything else he wants to kick in, and I'll say something if he doesn't. Go ahead, Ron, if you have anything.
Well, thank you. I just want to say that one way to foster innovation is to work with academia. And in my last comments, I said that we encourage universities to join into this program. We've accommodated a number of foreign students here in our facilities during the summer months. We have affiliates in Africa and Asia, in Latin America, in Europe. And so we think that there is a great potential to bring youth involved in this. Jack is one of our former grad students who's continuing on his PhD and has done some really remarkable work to demonstrate that this technology can solve the climate change problem because it is 100% renewable and 100% carbon neutral, but also zero collisions because we are isolated from the street. And this makes it possible to liberate the streets for people again. It's a very important part of what I think is a revolution in the urban landscape.
Yeah, thank you. I mean, your proposal is for an automated transit network in a campus, as you have explained. Where and what are the other locations you think where such an initiative could be deployed successfully?
Well, initially, it will be in areas of concentration. And eventually, because it's so low cost compared to other modes of public transit, it will reach out into less dense and distributed areas. And many cities have radial design of their transit networks. So crossing between those radii could be very effective. Industrial parks, commuting. So eventually we see a mesh of this technology, not just handling a particularly dense corridor. In the beginning, though, of course, there are opportunity sites that would be more attractive. Some people say airports, but I have doubts as to how airports are going to thrive in a post-pandemic world.
What do you think would be the incentive for a local authority to invest in such an infrastructure?
Well, the beauty of this technology is that actually local communities would not necessarily have to invest. There are private sector players who would like to be providing this under what we sometimes call build, own, operate, maintain, and then transfer. Boom T is a term used, and that we believe is feasible. So it's more a question of whether cities really want to make a change to carbon neutral, and in the process liberate the streets so that humans can survive in a thriving natural setting rather than being accosted by vehicles weighing 2 tons and traveling at 50, well, at lethal speeds, let's face it.
Ride bikes like Gustav has talked about.
Yeah.
Like to have more of that.
And if you want to have active mobility, bicycles, scooters, pedestrians, you've got to get rid of the cars. And cities like Barcelona are doing that. And so other cities can join in that way. And this facilitates that potential.
There is a question to you, actually. For what capacity, passengers per hour, are you planning your system for?
The capacity is very high in potential. The theoretical capacity with double tracks and such can be on the order of 50,000 passengers per hour. And that's because vehicles can follow at very close range, unlike regular vehicles. And because they're grade separated, there's no interference with traffic otherwise. We typically are looking at 10 to 20,000 people per day in the models that we've done so far.
Ours is relatively low speed. We were planning for somewhere between 10 and 13 kilometers.
And I just want to say one other thing about capacity. Capacity is not about the line that you're traveling on. It's about the number of stations that are accessible to people in a distributed way. So if I have one big station, I have to put up a parking garage. If I have a parking garage, I've got to have all these cars accommodated. Whereas with a system like this, if I can walk to a many inexpensive, well-distributed stations, I dramatically increase the capacity in that fashion. Because through automation, I can make the line become very high capacity.
Thank you. Maybe I had another question that I would like to put to Gustav, because in your presentation, you mentioned that your survey started in March 2020 and that you had to do some kind of recalibration, not recalibration, but you had to ensure that the response were not covering the COVID crisis. So in a sense, how would you think the COVID crisis could influence the outcome of the work and the analysis that you've done?
Yeah,
I know it's a $10,000 question, but or $10 million question, but I mean, just to give us an idea.
Yeah, no, that's a very valid concern, because when the lockdown measures came into place, of course, people just drastically halted their regular travel routines. So we made corresponding adjustments. So especially when asking about people's travel behavior, we were asking people to think about the pre-COVID travel behavior, and we hope that has remedied the issue as best as possible. But of course, there was always a small chance that the results might be affected by this, but we didn't find any obvious signs that this was the case. So we compared our travel data as well with the travel data from previous years, and we didn't find any substantial differences. So we are confident that our results do not stray too far away from what used to be normal, as we said.
Thank you, Gustav. So we are getting close to the end of this session. Before I would like to thank the speakers, maybe I should give them the opportunity to make a last statement or comment regarding their intervention or what has been addressed during this session. So the floor is yours.
Lynette was first, so she can.
Really happy to see, I mean, all these different alternatives and technologies and system, new systems, for shared mobility and so on. I think we need to have a little bit of everything, right? It's not going to be a single solution. So I think it's good that we're all, this session was quite well put together with the combinations that we have here. Thank you.
Thank you, Buff.
Yes, so we think solar-powered transportation is definitely a possibility, and we encourage cities and countries to look at this very seriously and get a hold of us. We have some experience in this. We can work together. Thank you.
Thank you, Gustav.
Yeah, it was amazing to see what other work is happening around the world. And yeah, also to see a glimpse of the future, what the future might hold for us. And it's still a long way to go for us. We're still, I think, just at the very beginnings, and there's still a lot we need to achieve to actually get where we want to in terms of emission reductions and climate mitigation. But I think if we keep up the pace, we are on track to hopefully make a difference.
Thank you very much. I'd like to thank the speakers for their presentation, for their participation. I'd like to thank the participants for their contribution and their questions. I'm afraid that we have overpassed the time allocated to us in that session. So I don't know if we have been cut out from the rest of the world. If not, then I'd like to invite the participants to take a well-deserved 15 minutes break, and they will have the opportunity to come back to session 2, which will be on transport innovation for rural and remote areas, and that will start at 3:15 Brussels time. Thank you again for your participation. Bye-bye.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Thank you.